Okay.
Hi everyone, I'm pleased to introduce you to our guest today, Dr. Yana Meerzon. I met Dr. Yana first at the University of Reading in the UK, and then I met her again in Belgrade during FTR 2018 conference. Professor Yana teaches for the Department of Theatre, University of Ottawa. Her research interests are in drama and performance theory and theatre of migration and nationalism. Her book publication include A Path of the Character, Michael Chekhov's inspired acting and theater semiotics in 2005, and Performing Exile, Performing Self, a drama theater film, Paragraph 2012. She co-edited several collections on this topic, including Performance, Exile, and America, with Sylvia Dystrophic, Paragraph 2009. History, Memory, Performance is another book with David Dean and Catherine Prince, Paragraph 2015, a two-volume project on theatre and immigration in Canada, published in June 2019. Together with Dr. Penny, she worked on a special issue of the journal Modern Drama Fall 2018, which focused on multilingualism and migration, and the book Dramaturgy of Migration, Staging Multilingual Encounters in Contemporary Theatre, Aratley 2019. As we see, Dr. Yana is a prolific writer, and it is a great honor for us here at the University of Anbar to have her in this Zoom call. I invite my colleagues to ask their questions if they have any at the end of the talk. You can write your questions on chat box. It is easier for Dr. Yana to answer. Now the time is for you, Dr. Yana, to speak.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I would like to thank you, Dr. Majeed Midhin, for this invitation and University of Anbar. I wish it was in physical form, not virtual form, but it's really a great pleasure. And I hope, this adventure is going to be interesting and useful for everybody. So I will talk for about 45, 50 minutes. I have lots of pictures, lots of slides to show. If I also have about a couple of video, so to illustrate some examples. And then will be very, very happy to take some questions, So now I'm going to share my screen with my slides, and start the lecture. So this is the focus of my talk today on theater and multilingualism. And I also will show you a couple of, this is a page, with some book covers, that might be interesting for you. I know that this is the things that that I worked on, and they're really directly connected to what we're talking about today. So, and I know that these books might be difficult to obtain in Iraq, but if you have questions, if you're interested, let your professor know, and we'll probably arrange some kind of PDF forms or something for you to see these books. And now to the topic of this presentation on theater and multilingualism. Theatrical multilingualism has recently come to focus in many contemporary theater practices. Theatrical multilingualism, the focus must remain with the subjects of movement. If we take into account people rather than texts, then the implications of translating them, the people, necessary foreground ethical questions, such as responsibility and hospitality of translation. But hospitality can be ambivalent, specifically if a migrant must express themselves in the language of the host. Such hospitality puts a seeker of protection into a vulnerable position, but it also encourages the act of self-translation that can ensure the agency and the voice of a migrant. Theater is one of those public venues where the voice of a migrant can be heard, and the power and the faults of multilingual expression can be interrogated. To reflect a relational and liquid nature of today's transcultural encounters, theatrical multilingualism employs various tactics of self-translation: translation for others, and non-translation, when the artist refuses translating the speech of one character for the benefit of the others or for the benefit of the target audiences. Multilingual performances investigate potentials of interpersonal communication and also function as aesthetic experiments. Building on the ethical functions of theater, such as truth-seeking and performing justice, multilingual performances pursue theatrical truth and thus rely on what I call dramaturgy of authenticity. When the characters of migration speak in the language of the actors who enact them, this experiment, estrangement of audience perception, a technique that leads to creating poetry on stage, is a primary device of such performance. The act of estrangement puts a monolingual audience member into a critical stance or puzzlement, and it comments on the prevailing spirit of neocolonialism with the domineering power of English as the language of global communications. Accessibility of a multilingual dialogue, as well as simultaneity, multiplicity, and linguistic dynamics, mark the scale of openness and comprehensibility that theatrical multilingualism offers. To monolingual citizens of a nation state, a multilingual production might remain closely, but it is spectators, if its spectators are multilingual, it can be partly open. Different moments of this multilingual encounter will be accessible to different spectators. This ambiguity presents the most challenging and exciting work of theatrical multilingualism. In the following, I propose a preliminary analytical model to discuss linguistic non-hospitality, as Karpinski called it, in which an encounter between multilingual on and off-stage actants takes place, and through which a divided self of a migratory subject is enacted. Focusing on different practices of non-translation, when a multilingual dialogue is spoken on stage with or without simultaneous translation, I examine tactics of accessibility and degrees of incomprehensibility of such performance. 3 case studies of theatrical multilingualism that I look at offer 3 scenarios of dramaturgical authenticity in which multilingual dialogue serves as an iconic sign to the truth of the characters' past and present experiences of migration and to theatrical truth of the fictional encounter between them. My first case study of the dramaturgy of authenticity is authenticity in representational key, when the character's mother tongue functions as an emotional connector to their true self, lost in the multiplicity of identities that the situation of migration imposes. This was my second scenario is a partly translated multilingual dialogue of socio-political commentary. It relies on intertextual and on-stage inter-character translations. It comes on the power of the state subjects as illustrated by Olivier Chouinier's production, Polyglot. A non-translated multilingual dialogue, my third scenario of the dramaturgy of authenticity, refers to the on-stage situations when the characters speak in the languages of their choice without providing any translations either for their immediate interlocutors or audience members. I call these multilingual practices a synesthetic experiment. The 2017 many-lingual project in sundry languages created by Toronto Laboratory Theatre and directed by Art Babians, to which I served as a dramaturge in April 2019, exemplifies this practice. This project envisions its spectators familiar with many, but not all languages used on stage, and so becomes an example of decolonizing practices of theatrical multilingualism. All 3 cases add to the strategies of linguistic non-theatrical multilingualism. So now we begin a part which is a little bit more theoretical, and then we'll go into the examples. So this part is called Contextualizing Theatrical Multilingualism. Marvin Carlson traces the history of theatrical multilingualism to the Renaissance Europe of its macaronic stage, when passages in Latin and vernacular were spoken on stage without any translation. This type of multilingualism did not present a problem of comprehensibility because before the appearance of the nation states, audiences were themselves macaronic. So when the creators of vernacular texts in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance included Latin passages, they could obviously assume that they would be accessible at least to the learned among the audiences. Historical avant-garde of the 20th century and its intercultural theater practices presented other attempts at theatrical multilingualism, often marked by mismatches of intention and the risk of decontextualization, appropriation, and commodification of language. Today's theatrical multilingualism is mostly practiced in the context of international theater festivals, co-productions, and touring shows that echo and appeal to the strategies of communication in the multicultural urban centers, when individuals freely switch from one language to another. It is slowly becoming a prominent element of the productions created by and featuring migrant artists or about migration, with Maxim Gorky Theater in Berlin being one of its primary examples. Prompted by the questions of truth and authenticity, this multilingualism tends to merge and absorb its many languages, and so it bears resemblance to theatrical syncretism. Methodologically, it relies upon syncretic tactics of intercultural performance, and it uses European and non-European strategies of decoding information. Politically, it provokes and intervenes, as it gives voices to marginalized people, to better reflect what Homi Bhabha equals subjects. Theater dialogue spoken in several languages demonstrates how the sense of multiple belongings as experienced by a migrant subject can be revealed through the speech of one character and reinforced. Hello. So a theater dialogue spoken in several languages demonstrates how the sense of multiple belongings as experienced by a migrant subject can be revealed through the speech of one character and reinforced through the code switching and code mixing of the others. It also suspends audience reception by immersing spectators in the state of not knowing. To access such dialogue, the audience must reserve to the compensatory strategies of comprehension, as we must pay attention to the physical work of the actors and the materiality of the stage signs, as well as the rhythms, the atmospheres, and the energy flows engendered by the performance. This way, multilingual theater approximates a non-verbal performance and evokes an image of the world as a global marketplace. Approaching theater translation as linguistic non-hospitality, an artist of a multilingual background can either focus on close situations and ignore the existence of anyone outside the given culture, or transliterate all dialogue into the base language of the given culture. Roman Jakobson's six-function model of communication offers a useful methodological frame to discuss the working of this theatrical multilingualism. So the next part is called Towards the How of Theatrical Multilingualism. Imagined as a continuous flow of information, Jakobson model recognizes two of its functions linked to the work of dialogue, interlocutors, or subjects. Emotive function refers to the sender's current situation or state of being, as it colors the emotion that she attributes to the denotative meaning of the statement. Whereas conative function refers to the implied reactions of the addressee, who is responding to it. Emotive function can refer to the frustrations and the accomplishments of the multilingual encounter, whereas conative function is related to the linguistic gestures of meaning, clarification, and action imperatives produced by multilingual speakers. The remaining 4 functions relate to the exchange of message itself. Referential function serves to dissolve casual contact. Poetic function refers to the making of the message itself. It dominates stylized speech in which the form of expression takes over meaning. Metalingual function is strictly linguistics. They connect it to the working of what Jacobson calls code of utterance and used to describe the code itself. In a theater dialogue that seeks authenticity in representation of migration, referential function prevails. It relates directly to a commitment of theatrical realism, a specific theoretical position deriving from a concept of the play as a mirror of life. Here, multilingualism is used to investigate how city talk becomes a theater talk, and how the languages, dialects, and sociolects of the country find themselves reflected and utilized on stage. Referential function capitalizes on the awkwardness of transcultural encounter and language stereotypes. It relies on barbaric speech, including dialect, accent, making linguistic errors, and shortage of vocabulary, to expose language as a social construct. The primary role of referential function is to realistically denote the identity of characters as members of a certain cultural and linguistic group or class. Moreover, referential function reveals the ultimate non-translatability of myself to others. Language is never a subject to a neutral stance, so we're permanently involved in the practices of cultural translations when we try to translate ourselves to the other, doing it either in our mother tongue or in a newly acquired language. Cultural translation goes beyond pure linguistic transcoding. It imagines subjects sharing cultural environment in which language originates. However, as we cannot really translate ourselves to the others, we can only use the language of this other to help them make their own translations of us for themselves. Translation in this case is driven not by the efforts of a translator, but by those by an addressee. The work of cultural translation becomes specifically intriguing in the multilingual productions, which use the communal strategies of vernacular multilingualism. Multilingual productions can rely on our ability to follow its action, not only through understanding spoken word, but also through engaging with its paralinguistic signs. A multilingual productions forces us to pay special attention to the work of the actors' bodies, gestures, and facial expressions, to the changes in the rhythms and intonation of their speech, the use of pauses, the how of the communication over the what of the message. Many migrant artists work across cultural and linguistic zones of contact and frequently imagine their audiences as increasingly versatile in this translingual practices of communication, more tolerant to enduring gaps of meaning and fragmentary perception. These artists often rely on audiences' visceral attention to and perception of the act of enunciation on stage, manifested in the work of accents, intonation, or dialectal coloring, as well as non-linguistic signs such as gesture. So now I'm finishing my kind of a dry theoretical part of this presentation, and I'm going to go into 3 different examples, to analyze them. So I don't know if you're familiar with these examples. So I prepared you a couple of little videos, to help you to kind of, visualize productions that we're talking about. So I'm going to stop this slide for a second, and I'm going to now show you a little video from, just one second, I'll find how to do that for a second. The little video that should take us to the first example. The only thing is a problem. I cannot, doesn't seem to be, sorry, found it. Okay. So the first play is by Wajdi Mawad called Toutes des Oiseaux. And I hope you can see it. if you cannot see it, we will try. Play was performed in French in Paris, you know, so, but at least you'll see some movement going on, and I couldn't find it in English. So let's see what it is, and I hope we can. Oh no, someone. Okay. Can you hear me? Can you see the video? Yeah, does it work, Majeed? Hello? Is the video working?
It is very slow.
It's very slow. Okay, but you can hear it, right?
Yeah. I
Okay.
can hear you. Yana, there is no voice.
Oh, okay.
In the video.
Okay, well, I'll try again. It's a little strange, you know. It should be, because it works for me. Yeah. Okay, sorry. I think it should be better now.
Yeah, it's okay now.
Okay. So the point is that they all switch in different languages. There are 4 languages in this production, and that's how they played it in Paris. So the only, but of course, you know, they translated into French for the Parisian audience, and I'll talk about it a little bit more. I just wanted to show you some how it looks like and sounds.
C'est legal! C'est un cliché! C'est comme ça,
The diplomat. Your thesis. Who is the man?
Hassan Mohammed Al-Wazan.
Komm zurück, Ethan. Wir sehen weiter. Alles wäre möglich, wenn du die Augen öffnest. Alles. Ethan.
حجر لا يمكن أن يقول شيئا عن آلام وأفراح صاحبه.
So I think we're good now, right? You know, so so I just wanted to give you a chance to kind of have a feeling about this particular work, you know, because it does, you know, use 4 languages on stage, and the characters do not translate anything for each other, but the company does translate things for us, you know. So now we're going back to the slides, and I'll do some analysis of this work very specifically. I'll talk more about it, like context and stuff. Okay, so so this is a play which was created in 2017. It's called Toutes des oiseaux or All the Birds by Wajdi Mawad, who is a Lebanese Quebecois artist and currently residing in France. This play, and he's now the artistic director of Théâtre de la Colline in Paris. This play takes us to the heart of political, existential, and religious debates that upset today's citizens. It speaks to Foucault's monumental history, the history of the state and of the world as it affects individuals, each made responsible against their will for setting this history right. As often in his theater, language is the focus of Wajdi Mawad's artistic political investigation. This time, it is the aesthetic potential of on-stage multilingualism that drives its political message home. Written in French and translated for the benefit of the performance into English, German, Arabic, and Hebrew, Tout des Oiseaux evokes the vernacular of today's Europe, with the members of a nuclear family sharing traits of each character's linguistic and cultural identity, and so it becomes a tool of Mawad's theatrical truth. Set between New York and Jerusalem, Tout des Oiseaux unfolds across 3 generations of one Jewish family. In its title, translated into English as Birds of a Kind, it refers to the idea of multiple truths that can differently apply to the members of one family. These truths can coexist together, but be impossible to reconcile. The play begins with Eitan, a young German scientist of Jewish background, decides to introduce Wahida, an Arab-American woman, the love of his life, to his family. His father, David, a Jew of traditional beliefs, condemns this love because of the religious and cultural differences between the young people. Unable to argue with his father and realizing that there is a secret that marks his identity, Eitan decides to seek the answers in Jerusalem. A terrorist attack on the Allenby Bridge that connects the Palestinians of the West Bank and Jordan interrupts Eitan and Wahida's traveling. Eitan ends up in the Israeli hospital in coma, whereas Wahida is left to bring his estranged family together. In the second part of the play, the truths different to each character resurfaces, and it causes repercussions impossible for either of them to reconcile. In this new take on the story of Romeo and Juliet, Eitan stands for everything male and rational, whereas Wahida represents everything irrational and sensual. So the voluptuous power of her presence confuses and angers people. The ways these 2 characters connect to language, rationally or sensually, illustrates their differences and serves Mawad as the major tactic of dramaturgical authenticity. Tout des Oiseaux, he explains, is the story of fragmentations and paradoxes. So to better express themselves, the characters must speak in different languages. Eitan is both the benefactor and the victim of this multilingualism, as his ability to speak languages stems directly from the consequences of war and exile that his family was subjected to. When Eitan needs to communicate with his father, he switches to Hebrew, David's native language. But when the doctor tells Eitan's family that they should speak to Eitan in his mother tongue, Nora volunteers German as the language of his mother. However, the language of Eitan's emotional attachment is English, because he speaks English to Wahida. In the case of Eitan, therefore, Mawad presents multilingualism as a biographical and historical construct, and so he challenges the idea of mother tongue as something deeply visceral, emotionally binding, and subconscious. With Wahida's bilingualism, she speaks Arabic and English, Mawad draws a very different picture of linguistic authenticity. He demonstrates that even in the case of shifting identities, the psychophysicality of the mother tongue serves as the basis of one's identity. Witnessing the attack on the Allenby Bridge and finding herself on the Palestinian side after it connects Wahida back to her roots and native language. When she hears the song of her name spoken in the language of her father, and when Wahida faces who she is and fights the imposed truths of immigration. All her childhood, Wahida explains, she was trained to hide her identity. As an academic, she dedicated her life to prove how dangerous it is to let the principle of identity dictate your life, and how stupid it is to cling to your lost identity. Hearing and speaking her mother tongue in Palestine, Wahida rejects all these philosophies. The reality is simple, she declares. This is what I am. In Wahida's case, therefore, Mawad follows Freudian reading of a mother tongue as a tool that helps to fantasize a bodily as well as familial grounding in language, something tightly linked to such important manifestations of familial intimacy as affect, gender, and kinship. Linked to that is the artist's political preoccupation with reconciliation as a complex triumvirate of memory, forgetting, and forgiveness. As about our new historical condition, with thousands of people on the move, seeking new attachments and histories. It portrays its protagonists deprived of the true knowledge of their origins. Standing in front of Eitan's apartment, unable to knock at its door and join the family Seder that Eitan called into her name, Wahida summarizes their shared sense of historical liminality. She wonders whether people her age, and all like that, caught between two stories, listening to dreams collapse. However, when Eitan begins to question his origins and discovers that David, his Jewish father, was born Palestinian, a historical chasm opens, sorrows arise, and the necessity of the truth becomes as a hot iron. To Mawad, to stay away from this truth is not possible. History penetrates the very heart of Eitan's existence, the thing he thought was his identity. David's anger towards Palestinians, his narrow-mindedness, and his thirst for punishment serves as proof to Eitan's theory. Suffering is not transmissible by the chromosomes. Raised as a Jew without knowledge of his true origins, David is the product of nurture, not nature. Unable to reconcile this paradox, David must face his true self, which, according to Mawad, is tightly linked to one's mother tongue. David's native language, the language of his biological mother, is Arabic, and hence Mawad brings Leo the African into the action. So the Leo the African is the ghost kind of figure, in the center of this image, you can see, so he is an imaginary character, but very, very important. Protagonist of Simon David's book, he ended up at the court of Pope Leo X. To save his life, he agreed to convert to Christianity. Into this Wazoo, he emerges as a highly symbolic figure. A subject of Wahida's doctoral research, he connects the character's past and present. Through his silent presence as an observer of this family's drama, and by telling David the Persian tale of the amphibian bird, he provides a philosophical background to this cautionary tale. The bird, as Leo Tales goes, was so drawn to the life of the fish that despite her family's warning, it plunged into the water to join them. When the bird fell, the legend says, it grew gills and began to breathe. To Mawad, this tale of metamorphosis speaks the truth of a migrant's divided self and is called to teach his audiences something profound of our world and our relationship to the other, to the enemy. By staging an improbable historical and linguistic meeting between David and Leo the African, Mawad wishes to overcome political, geographical, linguistic, and symbolic borders that make people's identities and histories. Played by Jalal Atlaville, a Syrian actor refugee in France, Leo the African recounts his tale in Arabic and thus emerges as the most authentic character. Although David responds to him in Hebrew, the power of theater allows them mutual understanding. Here, Mawad breaks his own conditions of theatrical truth and invites his characters to converse in the language of spirituality beyond locutionary functions of a referential speech act. However, metamorphosis and disappearance mark the work of Mawad's own artistic language. In Tout des Oiseaux, French, the language of Mawad's theater, has no audio presence. The sense of disappearance, loss of power, and control over the language that Mawad encountered in this multilingual context took him back to his own childhood experiences when he was losing his mother tongue. In the playing hide and seek between Hebrew and Arabic was especially painful, Mawad offers, as with every switch of the language, the artist would re-experience the loss of his own mother tongue. At the same time, meeting an international cast of actors who spoke each in their native language and who share with Mawad the same story of origin, provided the artist with a chance to tell its story as only through storytelling enacted as many languages as it takes, the act of crossing towards the other can take place. So now we're going to stop with this production, and we're going to see another example of another show on the same subject. It's a Canadian play which was presented in 2015 in Montreal at the Festival Transamérique in Montreal in French. So I hope that this will work now. And if it doesn't, you know, you just let me know. It's a very short video, like a promotional video.
Je jure ou j'affirme solennellement que je serai fidèle et porterai sincère allégeance à Sa Majesté Elisabeth, Reine du Canada. Queen
But
of
unfortunately,
Canada.
it's a very, very short video, and I have some pictures, but in Canada, they don't, oops, sorry, in Canada, they don't really film well, you know, so yeah, it's not as
To fly a rocket ship, you
clear
need to be
as
an
the other one, but I hope, you know, as I speak, you know, you will understand better. Okay, so now we're moving to Canada and to my second example of theatrical multilingualism. Okay. So, and this part is called Enacting Canada Speak, Staging Dramaturgy of Authenticity as Social Commentary. Of non-professional actors, immigrants from Haiti, Colombia, Mexico, Iran, Guyana, and France. Polyglot premiered in 1915 at the Festival Transamérique. Intended to shake the festival public out of its comfort zone and make it confront its own fantastic vision of Canada and Quebec, the play dramatizes multilingualism from above, rendering its practices absurd. By enacting linguistic practices of Canadian immigration policies, or what I call Canada Speak, Polyglot criticizes an expert image of Canada. In its semi-interactive show, the audience is invited to follow the steps of an immigrant from their arrival to Canada till the citizenship ceremony, when one swears an oath to the Queen. Polyglot's dramatic structure follows the book Discover Canada, The Rights and Responsibilities of Citizenship, produced by the Government of Canada for immigrants to prepare for their citizenship test. Its dialogue follows the 1960s educational LPs called Polyglot Method of French Conversation, also intended for the new immigrants learning their second language. It stages the rigidity of the top-down educational practice, as this method envisions language learning as habit formation. So audiolingual activities primarily use repetition and drill to teach students correct forms in the new tongue. This method uses teacher substitution drills, asking students to follow mechanical exercises that reinforce structural patterns and practice vocabulary. In mimicking this rigidity, Polyglot reinforces and comments upon the state immigrant power paradigm. The text consists of questions and instructions borrowed from these LPs and the participants' immigrants' personal responses to these questions. It creates an effect of a big brother's touch, and as it is concealed in the disembodied language of the discs. In scene 4, the performers are instructed to respond to random questions about weather, business, and state of Canadian roads, grouped under the heading Useful Sentences on Various Canadian Subjects of Conversation. In the comic effect the scene produces, Polyglot brings the aesthetics of the theater of the absurd forward, in which the dialogue tends to get out of hand, so that words seem to go counter to the actions of the characters and degenerate into list of words and phrases from a dictionary conversation book, or to get bogged down in endless repetitions. In Polyglot, this linguistic absurdity is further reinforced through the mechanically repeated statements recorded in two languages. The play presents the immigrants' world as an incomprehensible place. The spectators see the happenings on stage entirely from the outside, without ever understanding the full meaning of the strange patterns of events. Polyglot pictures immigrants powerless before the official lingua of Canadian bureaucracy. The play criticizes meaningless cliché and the mechanical, circular repetition of stereotyped phrases of the Canada speak. In scene 9, when Henry, a pre-recorded voice of an invisible interrogator, demands, tell us a story of an unfortunate story, Sophia produces a monologue of a melancholic foreigner, whose strength lies in their misery, as it gives the state a chance to be kind and generous, or to only project an image of its generosity to the stranger. Julia Kristeva traces the history of this figure back to the Aeschylus tragedy, The Sapiens, with Danaids who flew to Argos seeking refuge at the Greek shores as the first foreigners in our civilization. As supplicants, they were guaranteed the protection of the state, but to receive it, they were expected to act needy, obedient, and grateful. Sophia's monologue builds on this image and is also deeply performative, as it relies on the power of a speech act to plea in the language of her protectors. To convince the authorities of their right to stay asylum seekers are compelled to produce a convincing story of individual persecution in their previous home and to show that this persecution would continue if they were returned. So they must exhibit the signs of defeat, submission, and destitute. In Polyglot's scene 21, this practice receives new manifestation. Participants are instructed to tell migrant and to draw pictures of a grateful foreigner, someone who accepts their fate with gratitude and so cannot be a threat to the host. In their failed attempts to construct this image of happiness, Polyglot's performers reverse to speaking in their native languages, a gesture that functions in this play as the migrant's auditory distinction and privilege. To implicate the Montreal audiences into this ongoing dilemma of immigration, in what language a foreigner must communicate to the state, Polyglot makes spectators stand and repeat the words of the recording. Henry's instruction make the Canada speak come to action. The audience's response is called to remind us that to recognize foreigner as man, not citizen, the state must esteem the someness of a refugee and grant them respect of an audible translation. So to acknowledge their mother tongue as a tool of empowerment. In this scene, spectators' emotional identification with the characters is replaced by a puzzled, critical attention. For while the happenings on the stage are absurd, they yet remain recognizable as somehow related to real life with its absurdity, so that eventually the spectators are brought face to face with the irrational side of their existence. The show closes with a reenactment of the ritual. As immigrants swear to the Queen's honor, the audience is instructed to leave the theater by taking a walk backstage. They pass a charismatic tableau vivant. Jacques Cartier and his first interview with the Indians, with the indigenous people of Canada. This tableau is made by the performers themselves. As we encounter this image of Canada's welcome, the audience is reminded of Jacques Cartier's, who was an explorer from Breton, colonial behavior as he lied to the Iroquois people of the cultural and legal significance of the cross that he planted on their land, claiming through this gesture their territories to France. The spectators are made to experience similar to the new immigrants' feelings of astonishment, intimidation, and embarrassment with the history and the image of their country. The ending, however, remains open. Typically to the politics of the theater of the absurd, it declares a wish for the detached audience, able to think for themselves. So now I'm going to move to my last example, and I'm going to show you a last video for this talk, you know, so, it is a show that includes 35 performers of multilingual performers who speak in many, many languages on stage, and they don't translate anything on stage for the audience. So I hope, you know, you still can see and hear me. So I'm making sure that the sound is good, and here we are.
There's no energy exchange anywhere here. The one place that felt different, it was Kensington Market. I met some musicians. They were sitting in a circle and playing in a park music in Kensington Market. I walked up to them and I want to tell them, لكم فدوى الله، هاي الدنيا القالب عليها أنا، هذا اللي جاي يدور عليه. But I didn't know how to say it in English.
Look at me. I'm using English, our secret language in high school, to keep your mama out of the loop.
So, what's with the accent?
Oh, it's mine.
In Canada, if you're not 大大咧咧, then you must be 有像屁眼一样，人人都有，你以为就你有屁眼呐
Los venden los combates con los rojos paliacates que la polvo impregnó. En aquella madrugada, todo halaga su mirada.
When you are intimate with somebody, do you think in Spanish or English? Both. It's weird for me when I think about, like when I'm having sex, I can't even think or say things in Russian because that's my mom's tongue. And that's
Ce café est tout noir et j'ai demandé du lait.
喂，阿姐，你嘅咖啡咪俾你咯。
Ce n'est pas ce que j'ai demandé.
阿姐，攞走
J'ai
啦。
demandé du lait. Du lait. Dedans, dedans.
咪喐手喐腳喎，阿姐。
Do you speak English?
Ah non, français?
No, français.
Ah,
Canada. It uses lots of body language to, you know, to tell its own stories, you know, and people often don't understand each other, so they need to use lots of gestures and lots of things. Okay, so so this is my last example, and we're almost done. So this part is called enacting Canada's common space speak, staging the choreography of non-translation. My closing case of linguistic non-hospitality is Art Babian's experimental project in sundry languages that offers a view of today's Canada as common space for its diverse subjects to meet and interact. With 80% of its dialogue spoken in the languages different to English or French, in sundry languages presents an example of multilingualism from below. In its techniques of theatrical non-translation, it relies on somatic and affective aspects of verbal communication, our experience of language as a sensory, embodied, and auditory construct close to music. This non-translated dialogue places its audiences outside theatrical action, similar to immigrants' everyday position outside the normative discourses of the state. In its attention to the physicality of speaking in sundry languages, stages the separation between I and myself as a gap between the performer's body and their linguistic performance. The word sundry in its title refers to the Old English expression syndrig, or distinct and separate. It signifies unity made of differences. The idea echoed both in this work's performative style, because it contains comic and realistic scenes, dance and musical theater sequences, and its politics. in sundry languages challenges the erroneous assumption that translation can give access to the true meaning of the original. Because in translation, meaning is always skewed. It's never the same as it is in the original language or culture. So the questions this project asks are, what happens when we don't hide the fact that things are not really translatable? What strategies would the audience develop to still understand what is happening on stage? Is there a way to create a dramaturgy complex enough so that the absence of translation doesn't induce immediate boredom? To generate responses and to devise a many-lingual script, Babians auditioned 35 multilingual actors of diverse cultural backgrounds. His assumption was that there will be enough spectators in Toronto multilingual auditorium who will understand more than 20% of this non-translated production, as they would use other languages to rely upon. To reclaim power from the Anglophone majority, he says, the company drew its inspiration from the participants' personal multilingual encounters in Canada, and it provided space for them to become multilingual dramaturgs. Depending on the changes in its ever-evolving cast and linguistic groups that make it target audiences, each show might include up to 16 different languages on stage. The action opens up with a symptomatic scene. A Canadian actor, white male, is auditioning for the role of a Russian mafiosi. The actor, Yuri, on your right, is a Russian speaker. His English is slightly accented, but not to the way the producer, played by Babians, accept. So Babians is here on the left. As the actor tries to improve his performance, the producer gets more and more angry. Finally, he comes up on stage to teach the actor the correct, or rather stereotypical Russian accent. At this point, the scene acquires a surrealist dimension, and the producer turns into the actor. The scene finishes in Russian, with the actor now in the role of the producer, teaching the producer now in the role of the actor the correct way to play the part. The scene produces the effect of an hourglass collapsing into itself, prompting the state of vertigo. As speaker of both languages, I find myself in the position of privilege. I enjoy both the symbolism of the action and the game of stereotypes. The rest of the audience, I imagine, remains in the position of outsider. Their linguistic work reminds of that of a migrant, as the non-Russian speaking viewers become self-translators and must adopt the visual information generated by the stage to the matrix of preconceived meanings that these images imply for them. Foregrounding this outsidedness as a marker of Toronto's cosmopolitan habitat in sundry languages stages the multilingualism of the city streets, not as a state-sponsored ideological myth, but as a reality. To fully participate in this experiment, spectators must make themselves available for the experience of not knowing, to be ready to give into confusion, fear, excitement, and bewilderment of a new to them language. Spectators' emotional generosity becomes their leading perception strategy. The highlight of this process is the performance's ending with a participatory scene entitled, "How do you say kiss me?" In your language. Yuri invites a non-Russian spectator who speaks English as their second language to briefly improvise a hello scene between strangers. A series of exchanges in Russian and English about love and loneliness takes place. Using jokes and poems, the performer builds an atmosphere of intimacy into which the audience falls. The scene creates a moment of recognition and trust as our cultural and linguistic fences drop. The humility and tenderness we associate with love create, just for a moment, a cosmopolitan utopia of equality and brotherhood. For a moment, I recognize myself in the body of a spectator who was brought onto the stage as a stranger and embrace my inner split. I see myself as an outsider once again, one of many other multilingual subjects sharing this auditorium. In its multilingual work, in other words, in sundry languages, focuses on a meta-theatrical potential of a theater performance. It addresses such fundamental issues of migration as reconstructing self through language, questioning the conditions of hospitality, and carving for oneself a personal space of engagement. And now I conclude. To conclude, the multilingualism, theatrical multilingualism subscribes to the idea that in the world characterized by global movement, by presenting migrants as interlocutors of their own stories and as self-translators, theatrical multilingualism envisions them in the dynamic shift from the object of translated to its active subject. It reminds its audiences that one must recognize today's linguistic norm as plurilingual, with the work of translation emerging not simply at the border crossing, but from within the multicultural space of strangers and neighbors. Theatrical multilingualism invites its audiences to practice skills of communication developed in the situation of everyday transcultural encounter. It employs on-stage and inter-character translations to help spectators follow the action, and it incites new theatrical choreographers of words as sound. Finally, it suggests new modes of perception as our interpretation of multilingual performances of communities of hope as a utopian brotherhood of equal subjects. Well, thank you so much. That was the end of this presentation. Yeah, I hope we have some time for questions, and thank you, extremely nice audience.
Yes, thank you very much for this stimulating and engaging lecture. Now it is time for questions. I'll start my questions. I want to bear with me, Dr. Yana. I have 5 questions.
Oh, okay.
Before I give chance to my colleague to ask.
Okay.
Yes, as we know, the critical discourse on multilingual theater is still in the making.
Yeah.
While the treatment and definition of multilingual theater differs greatly in relationship to the context in which it occurs. Yana manual describes a multilingual theater as the theater in which a significant part of the play is written and performed in other language than the official language of the country it is produced. Mm-hmm. My question is, do you agree that a polyglossic play text poses a particular challenge to translators whose goal exceeds the literal exchange of words in one language for those in another? I mean, if the target culture doesn't understand the socio-political conditions that determine the value of a speaker's language choice. I ask this question, and I have in my mind Nadia Hamzi, My Name is Dakhil Faraj. This is a play which is performed in Canada, I think.
Yeah.
Here she used Arabic and English to tell each story in its own language with the absence of a simultaneous or subsequent translation of Arabic lines.
Yeah, okay. So thank you for this text and question, Majeed. So if you remember the slide, so from the beginning, of this lecture, so I'll show you again, so maybe. First of all, this particular text, if you're interested, I'll show you this slide, was published in this book, Scripting Immigration, so we have sort of an English version of this text, so if you're interested, I can share it with you. Second of all, absolutely, I think that, first of all, there are 2 types of translation, I think, that we kind of, facing, one of them is translation for the stage, for the actors, something for people to see and hear, and to participate. And that it is a very different form of translation, versus to just a simple translation on page. Because when you're reading the text on page, there is nothing else for you to help to understand things, right? So there's just whatever, in front of you. Whereas when you're watching a performance, physical, experiential, process, of being together, with the actors, and following, all those paralinguistic signs, like gestures, facial expressions, rhythm, will help us to understand the thing better. And that my example of the third example was about, right? So because people don't translate for each other, but we watch them communicating, you know, with gestures, with body, and we hope that we understand them better, you know. But of course, I think that to translate that kind of text, you know, from one language to another just on page is extremely difficult. And I don't think that, I don't think if you just, you know, print, you know, the text as is, you know, in the book, you know, it will be comprehensible for anybody. So in the book, which I showed you, which I edited, you know, so we made some radical choices. So we actually decided not to translate the scripts, like the play by the one that you mentioned, you know, is published there, but also in sundry languages. So I'm waiting now for someone to theorize how to decode that text, you know. So, and my, you know, so my expectation is that people will look at this text as a picture, right? You know, so as a painting, not as a normal, you know, dialogue, you know, to stage, you know. So because what do you do with those signs, let's say in Chinese, if you don't read them, right? You know, so it's a very different experience of reading, I think, you know. Yeah. Otherwise, or the other option, you have to translate everything into the language of your target audience, right? You know, so which is a very different project, right? You know, so yeah. And by the way, the play, the first one I mentioned, you know, by Mawad, so it actually, in a printed form, it's all in French. So the beauty of the dialogue and the fact that, you know, the family members, you know, switch into language as they wish, you know, from Hebrew to Arabic to whatever, you know, so it's lost. So theater production, you know, is much more giving, you know, it has much more potential than just a paper, you know. Yeah. So I hope I answered that.
Yeah, great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great.
In
his discussion, the second question. In his discussion of race, and colonialism, Franz Fanon argues that means to be in a position to use a certain syntax to grasp the morphology of this or that language, but it means above all to assume a culture to support the weight of civilization. My question is, in a rainbow society, how multilingualism and multiculturalism work?
When you say rainbow society, you mean Canada?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a great question, you know. So it works on many different levels, right? You know, so when it comes to the official communication in school, at the universities, in foreign, like in particular offices, we all must use official languages, you know. So, and depending on the province, it's either English or French. So when it comes to education, you know, so for children, you know, so the education is offered in English or French, but there is an idea of heritage language, you know, that your children can acquire either at home or in special private schools, right? So multiculturalism in Canada is a legislation, is a rule, right? You know, so which implies, among many things, you know, that every diaspora, every ethnicity has the right to preserve their culture and their language. And it's done in a private form, you know, either private schools, a private cultural endeavors, and something like this. So very often children grow up multilingual already. So they speak the kind of, you know, native language of their family at home, and they speak at school either English or French, sometimes both, you know, the official languages. So when it comes to art, when it comes to theater, it becomes very, very problematic, you know, so because most of the mainstream theater is done either in English or in French. And therefore, a project like Art Babian's, you know, when he brings other languages on the mainstream stage of Canada is a revolution. Because all of a sudden, you know, he says, well, we're more than just two languages, you know, so we are this, you know, multicolored, you know, so very diverse society, and the theater should be kind of, you know, being a reflection of that society, you know, but it's not very common, and it's very, very new. It just started maybe a couple of years ago with this kind of experimental projects, you know. So I would say that most of the time, you know, so if you want to succeed as an actor, as a director, as a theater maker in Canada, you have to function in English or in French. And it becomes very tricky, you know, when you speak with an accent, right? You know, so because the theater wants to hear authentic, realistic kind of, you know, normative English, you know, and if you speak with what kind of accent, you know, so it's very difficult to believe for the audience that you are the authentic Canadian. So, and then of course, you know, there are so many questions related to who is your neighbor, who is the authentic Canadian today, when so many people speak English as a second language or French as a second language at home, you know. So it's a very complex question, you know, and it's not easy. But the work of someone like Art Babians is really revolutionary. It's not common, right? You know, so yeah, so that's in a nutshell.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, great.
The third question. In terms
of globalization,
do you think that multilingualism is in contrast with the romantic idea or a view of seeing the world as a small village where one language for one people and one culture and one nation state?
Yeah, that's a great question, you know. So especially now, right, you know, when we think it's a two-way process, right? You know, I think that one way or another, English has become this hegemonic, you know, sort of colonial kind of English language, you know, when everybody, because of the economic exchange, because of the international exchange, you know, we need to find some kind of language to speak. English happened to be that. Even now, right, you know, so we're speaking in English, you know, so my native language is not English, you know, so it's neither yours or the audience, you know, so we need to find the ways, you know, to communicate with each other. So is it good or bad? I don't know. It is what it is, right, you know, so, but I think that especially now, I think after this COVID situation, you know, I think the situation will be going in two directions at the same time. We will become more and more globalized and connected because of internet, you know. So this particular lecture wouldn't happen if there was no internet, if there were no Zoom, right? You know, so but at the same time, we also need to pay more attention to what's happening locally, you know, to our own communities, you know. So I think it's never one way. I think it's always different directions, you know. So we, on one hand, you know, so we need to be open to other people, and we need to find some kind of ways to communicate, you know. So unfortunately or fortunately, it's English right now, but on the other hand, we also need to be very attentive to what's happening locally. So, and I think that theater is a very different form. It's not it's more than just speaking, right? You know, theater uses images, uses music, uses gestures, you know, and all of those things, you know, so that can help us to get the meaning, you know. And sometimes, you know, in theater, if we don't get the meaning 100%, it's okay too, right? You know, so what's important is this communal experience, to be together and to kind of experience, you know, this, you know, moment of being in theater, you know, so with other people, which we all miss right now because of COVID and stuff, you know. So yeah, so I think it's a two-way street, you know, like to kind of make it closer to what you've asked, really, in my opinion.
Yes, the last question, because I want to give chance for my colleagues. Why do people become multilingual?
Well,
It's a general question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, you know, so there are many different circumstances, you know. First of all, depending where you grew up, you know. So I grew up in a very monolingual culture. I grew up in Russia, and at that point it was Soviet Union, so where everybody spoke Russian, and we were taught foreign languages just because it kind of, you know, was part of our educational system, because our teachers in our country, our state thought that it would be good for people to practice, to know something, about foreign languages, but we never practice it really. So then, I moved to Canada, and of course, when you are in a different country, you have to participate in a different economy. You have to start working, you have to earn your life, your salary and stuff, and you cannot do it necessarily in your language. So very often it's just a necessity, of people to, to function in different situations. And I think that economic necessity, especially when it comes to trade, again, economic exchange, globalization, pushes you to be multilingual, so you can, sort of succeed in your economic needs, right? So that's one scenario. And then the other scenarios is, depending on the country where you are, so you might be growing up in a very, very multicultural situation, so the country might not be multicultural. I'm thinking about Germany or France, but because there are so many immigrants, right, already, so, and very often, the immigrant families, they really cherish their language, their native culture, so they would speak native language and native tongue, in their home, and give it, one or other way, to children, so there are also mixed marriages, when one parent might be speaking French, another might be speaking German, and but maybe they're living in Sweden, and the children, learn Swedish, so I think it's the multilingualism becomes some kind of very natural way of living, depending on the country, depending on the situation where you are. So I think it's a range of, possibilities. And for some people, learning languages is a form of resistance as well, so like if we're talking about, some countries, where things are a little bit more difficult, so knowing foreign language, might be a way of escape, a way of getting in touch with other universes, so I think it's really difficult, I mean, it's a huge question, so you really contextually, depends on stuff, yeah.
Yeah, great. There is a question raised by Dr. Suhair.
Okay.
Do you think that multilingual theater leads to a renewal and change in spectators' imagination?
Yeah, there was just I'm not. There was another question, about identity. So can you repeat, because there are so many? So can you repeat the one? Because I will be done taking yours. Yeah, from you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you think this is a question by Dr. Suhair? Do you think that multilingual theater leads to renewal and change in spectators' imagination?
Great, thank you. Yes, I think it's a wonderful way of, sparking our imagination, and let us to kind of be free with our interpretation, so I think that especially in the English Canadian context, and in the English context in general in theater, so we are very much too much relying on the text, or what people say, what they and our need to understand every word, but theater is very different, right? So multilingualism allows us, to go beyond that, so, and rely more on our other experiences, so like, because we in life we use gestures, we'll use body language, rhythms, and that's why I like it. Yeah.
Yes, another question is by Zahra. Do you think that multilingual leads to a loss of identity?
No, that's also a great question. I don't think so. Well, because I think that, again, depending on the context, so if you grew up in a country like Canada, or in contemporary Europe, so which is very, very mixed, so a priori, your identity is very complex, so you cannot say, for example, my children, so I have 2 children, and both of them were born in Canada. Both of them know Russian, and they speak it, and they know Russian references and stuff, from the family, but they also grew up with their friends. And my son already say that they are both little bit Russians, little bit, Canadians, and in one case more English Canadian, in the other case more French Canadian. So multilingualism is a representation of this inherited complexity. And because, and I'm thinking, so in Canada, it's a good thing, right? In Canada, it is supported, so by government, by legislations, by our laws, it is not part of the law and is not part of legislation system, So I think that people of those multiple identities in other societies, they feel very confused, they feel very displaced and maybe outsiders, So I think it depends on the context, on the country's, sort of view on the context. But I don't think it ever yeah. So of course, and there are many experimental forms, so of art, that uses different, this whole thing, can be really, we could spend another 3 hours, really, analyzing all the usages of language, So I didn't talk about things, for example, how different languages can be used as conjugates, right? So in, for example, in the older, so we can talk about this, so or you can talk about I don't know, how do you realistically represent different characters, like Mawad does. So you use different languages to do that, so, and to show the truth of whatever the situation. So multilingualism on stage can be used for many different functions, so and so on. Yeah.
Yes, another question is by Saif.
Mm-hmm.
He said, do you think that multilingual performance can challenge the audience assumptions of a stable character identity?
Oh, yes.
By playing the gap between ethnicity, class, gender, and other identity signifiers?
Absolutely, that's another great question. Yes, absolutely. It's exactly what they're trying to do, and especially what Babians was doing, because we know that we kind of function by stereotypes, right? So whether we want it or not, right? So when we meet new people, especially from different cultures, the first thing we are, they communicate like that first, so they go with the stereotype first, whether we want it or not. But as soon as we start pushing those stereotypes, as soon as we start making fun of them, as soon as we start showing specifically on stage that stereotypes are just really like a surface layer of who we are, we can also push audiences to think about it, themselves, So it's very interesting how, in Babian's show, people laugh a lot, and they laugh at characters, but also at themselves. And then we had a lot of discussions, with the audience after the show, and everybody would start questioning, what they think about the others, so how far, they go in their stereotypical thinking, so absolutely, that kind of theater can do it for sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Another question is by also Zainab. Do you think that multilingualism has a transmission of people's ideas in the modern theater to deal with other cultures more consciously?
Yeah, so for sure, so multilingualism is not today's invention, right? So it actually, I know you probably heard of the intercultural theater practices, that started a long time ago in the 60s and even before, with this whole post-colonial movement and stuff, So you probably heard of someone called Eugenio Barba, who already in his practice, started mixing languages on stage as kind of artistic experiment, right? So Absolutely, you know, so the idea of mixing languages on stage, you know, has this kind of educational function, you know, so artistic, but also educational, you know, so to show us how rich other cultures are, you know, and how different, you know, they can be in exchange, you know, with each other, and how enriching, you know, those encounters, you know, can be. So absolutely, you know, multilingual theater has a history. It has its political and educational function, and absolutely, you know, so we can use it, you know, to educate other people about other cultures, I think, for sure, for sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. There is another question by Dr. Ahmed. He said, John B. Waston claimed that multilingual theater enables the playwright to explore issues of identity more extensively. The question is, do you think multilingualism in a performance can be a positive? In other words, it's enriched experience?
Experience of who?
Experience of the playwright, the actors.
Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting question as well. So very often, you know, when we talk about migration, and we talk about you know, people who migrate and write plays, you know, like artists, you know, so they use writing and they use theater stage, you know, as kind of a space to maybe investigate their own trauma, maybe to investigate their own experiences, maybe to investigate what happened, you know, to them, because the moving from one place to another, even if you just moved as immigrant, as economic immigrant, very, very difficult, right? You know, so it's lots of trauma, lots of adjustment and so on. So absolutely, using multilingual dialogue on stage, or even glimpses of native language, you know, can help people making those investigations, you know, understanding, you know, reconciling their own trauma, reconciling their own history, their own experience, you know. So many writers, I only used two, you know, from actually, no, three of them, you know, from Canada, Canadian experience, but Canadian theater is made by immigrants, you know, one way or another, you know. So every different writer, you know, uses those glimpses of different languages, you know, to speak about this very traumatic experience of their own. So yes, it can be very enriching. It can be healing, if you want, you know, so it can be helping people, you know, to deal, you know, with the deep traumas, you know, that they've experienced either as children or as an adult. And then for people, you know, for the actors, you know, so it's also a very interesting process, you know, because of course, you know, the actors, the directors, you know, they want to participate in the mainstream theater, which is done in English or in French, you know. So in order to succeed, you know, they want to be on television, they want to be in films, they want to be visible on big stages. So they try very hard, you know, to write, to work, you know, to act, to direct in their second languages. But it's not very often that it happens, you know. There are many different reasons why people cannot do that. So when there is a chance for them to come out on stage and do something in their own language, but also, you know, be visible, you know, to Canadian mainstream audiences, you know, they really grab it, and they kind of, you know, they strive, they're very happy to do that, you know. So I think that it kind of goes both ways, you know, and to, especially now, like, you know, before that, you know, so earlier, maybe 20 years ago, you know, those experiments were very marginal, and people were not really accepting it, you know. So, but now, you know, the world has changed, especially in Canada, and people are curious about those experiments, you know, so they're interested in how things in different sounds and different, you know, sort of color, you know, on stage. Today we talk a lot about the notion of diversity, you know, in Canadian theater. So yeah, so we became a little better in this, you know. So we give a little bit more space of, you know, to people who are not on mainstream, who are. So yeah, the experiences can be extremely enriching and also helping, you know, in this understanding and working through personal trauma, if you want, especially in people like Wajdi Mawad, for example. Yeah.
Great. Another question by Dr. Marwan. What are the major strategies that distinguish kinds of multilingual theater?
Another great question. I think that, as I said, you know, there are many of them, you know, so, and there's a scope. So it depends. I think you have to start with the question is who your audience. So is that a strictly monolingual audience that has no or does not want to have experience with different language, you know, so, and, or is it an audience of Toronto in which people speak so many languages and only, so there was a statistics, you know, that said that in Toronto today, 60% of its population speak English as a second language, right? You know, so it means that 60% of 5 million city speak many languages at home, right? You know, they can switch, you know, so it depends on who your audience is, right? You know, so, and it also depends, what do you want this audience to understand? Do you want to tell a story that everybody knows maybe, and they can just kind of follow the reaction, or is it something very concrete and they don't know the story and they need to know some kind of, you know, moments of action, you know, that they kind of can follow, you know. So I think that I would be very careful saying that there is this kind of blanket, one fit for all kind of, you know, technique of dramaturgy of making multilingual performance. I think it really depends on your project, on your audience, on the material, and on your objectives, right? You know, so let's say everybody knows Hamlet by Shakespeare, you know, or Romeo and Juliet. So in this case, you don't need to worry about the content. But if I'm going to tell you a story that happened to me in Ottawa, in Canada, you know, you never heard of me or Ottawa or Canada, I need to give you more material, you know, that you can follow. And how do I do this? You know, that will depend on my artistic project. Do I speak more? Do I give you synopsis like they do in opera? Do I don't know, create some kind of little, you know, translations? I don't know. It all depends, you know. So I think I would be right now very careful, you know, telling you that there is one kind of, you know, strategy, you know. So I think it needs to be very carefully thought through by the director, by the company, and by the dramaturg, right? You know, so all together. So yeah, I hope it helps. Yeah.
Great. Another questions by Omar.
Okay.
Do you think by using such a technique of multilingualism, will scatter the main idea? The main idea will be lost from the performance?
Yeah, so that's another great question, right? You know, so again, you know, so it depends, you know. So you know, we always say that well, it depends on the audience and it depends on the director, you know, and we always say that in theater, you know, so what's important is what we call directorial vision, right? You know, so even, you know, when it comes to a story that everybody knows, like Hamlet, you know, so every director, new director, will come and create some kind of theatrical world, you know, and theatrical story that will give us a new reading of this major play. So, and sometimes, you know, they can use different, you know, I don't know, different ways to do that, costume, color, I don't know, projections, whatever, you know, to convey that story. So the same with multilingualism, I believe, you know, so really, you know, so when you're doing a multilingual production, it really depends on the director a lot, you know, so how do you make sure that the major idea that you want to convey maybe some kind of political statement, maybe some kind of artistic statement, you know, how is that really transferred to the audience, you know? So again, I don't have a recipe. It depends on the situation, you know. Some people, so I think that it is possible to make sure that the audience knows and follows one idea of yours, your major idea, but it's also possible that details will be lost. So I guess, you know, again, it depends on the project, right? You know, so how much you want to be, you are okay with to be lost, how much you are really, you know, focusing on transmission, you know, so and so on. So I hope it helps again, you know, so.
Thank you very much, dear Dr. Yana. We are really so grateful for your engagement.
Oh, that was fantastic. You are such an involved audience.
I think you are tired now, and there are so many questions, but I have to stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the invitation. Yeah, so let me know if you want some text.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Yana.
thank you. That was fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Bye.